Welcome to the ISSA webinar for January 17th, sponsored by TrustCloud. Trust Assurance for Security Teams, a 6-point scorecard to upgrade your GRC program. I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and I'd like to thank our sponsor, TrustCloud, for putting on this wonderful webinar. My name is Amelia Godotti with ISSA International, and I'll be your facilitator today. If you are not yet a member of ISSA International, please visit issa.org to learn more about the benefits of membership and join today. We would like to encourage you to ask questions of our speaker today. To ask your question, type your question in the questions area of your screen. We will collect all questions, answer along and during the open Q&A segment that follows the presentation. We'd also like to encourage you to share your insights you hear on social media. And after today's event, the presentation slides and a recorded version of the webcast will be available on the ISSA web conference page. You will also be given the opportunity to print a viewing certificate on this webcast page on BrightTalk that you can submit for continuing education credits such as CPE and CEUs in accordance with various certifying bodies. Today, I am pleased to introduce today's moderator, Jim Hansen. Jim Hansen recently served as the Chief Executive Officer and Director of Redacted from July 2022 to June 2023, which is his most recent role leading the go-to-market teams for cybersecurity software companies. He was the President and Chief Operating Officer at Swimlane from April 2019 to June 2020, and from March 2009 through November 2018, served in a variety of roles, including Vice President of Sales, the President, Chief Operating Officer, and Director of Co-Offense, formerly PhishMe, a leader in the anti-phishing space. Prior to leading Co-Offense, Jim was a co-founder and Chief Operating Officer of Mandiant, which delivers cybersecurity incident response and forensic products and services. He has also served as a Director of Cyberbit, a leading cybersecurity firm. That is quite the background. Jim, welcome, and please begin the conference and introduce our speakers.
Hey, Amelia, thank you very much. I think that was a long-winded way of saying I'm really old and been in this a while, so that was the short version of it. So pretty excited today to hear our panel talk about kind of how they're really approaching the concept of trust assurance. You know, I've come pretty clearly from the vendor side of the house and struggled with the battle that all of us go through in terms of trying to formulate, collate, and kind of operate off the answers that we need to for our prospective customers' security and compliance questionnaires. So I'll probably jump in on our presenters with a question or two when they get to that part of the presentation. I think everyone's going to hopefully learn quite a lot from this presentation, both the concepts and the structure behind trust assurance and the platform that TrustCloud has worked into it. So you can not listen to me and listen to folks that'll provide some value here. I'd like to start introductions of our presenters, if I could. So leading it off, Tejas Renate is the Chief Product Officer over at TrustCloud. So in his wheelhouse, he's got engineering, design, and product direction. He's also heavily focused on kind of the strategic direction of the company and the platform. He's got a background in management and software engineering, both at Progress and MicroStrategy, and he's really got a great blend of customer-focused needs and then translating them into products and solutions that can help those customers achieve those needs. So he'll be leading our discussion today. Joining him is Shannon Noonan. Shannon's got an interesting background. She's got, security, believe it or not, accounting, and compliance all in her wheelhouse, and runs her own consultancy firm called High Noon, where she's the CEO and founder. So to give a great perspective on the problem and the challenge that we're looking at from the outside as an advisor. And then Dan Walsh is joining us. He's the CISO, so an actual person that lives with this day in, day out, 24/7. This is his third time being a CISO, 2 prior positions also in the healthcare space. So he also, besides kind of his day job, helps cloud-based security companies figure out their go-to-market, their focus, their product needs as an advisor, and has even gotten involved in some M&A activity. So without further ado, I'll kick this over to Tejas so you can walk through the presentation. And please do answer or ask your questions in the chat panel. I'll be writing that and looking forward to jumping in with them. Thanks.
Thank you, James. I welcome everybody. I'm Tejas, and I love that both Dan and Shannon have these extensive backgrounds in security, compliance, audits, accounting, and so on. So my role today is to be the facilitator of the conversation more than the speaker, because I think these are the two experts that are bringing a lot of experience to the table for the topic that we're talking about. Um, Before I start, I just wanted to sort of frame this in the context of Trust Cloud and um, my role at Trust Cloud. Um, Trust Cloud started out of a personal frustration for me and my founding team, of having been in GRC and security questionnaires and trying to do business with enterprises and doing it the old-fashioned way with spreadsheets and consultants and lots of time and energy. Um, so we thought of this problem as, what is the modern way of thinking about GRC that not only enables you to manage risk in your business, but also establish trust with everybody that you do business with. And out of that need and that desire was born Trust Cloud. We are about a 4-year-old company, and something I'm really proud of over these 4 years is we've worked with some of the most security-minded companies on the planet, who all trust Cloud with their GRC programs. So that's who I am and where we come from. Um, the thing that I've learned over talking to hundreds of folks in the security and GRC space is a lot of us are dealing with very similar sets of problems around building trust with our boards, our customers, our auditors, our vendors, and so on. And in a typical day of your life, you are getting bombarded with a variety of these types of questions around, are you done with a security questionnaire? Um, and employees are um, asking you about phishing emails and real threats. Um, there's audits that you're responsible for, and the process of preparing for those is entirely manual and based on spreadsheets and based on screenshots of evidence. And the business wants to move really fast, and so you're getting thrown new requirements all the time around, can we support new standards, can we go into new markets? um, and the typical role of a GRC team today is to be in a position of balancing all of these requirements, and being able to articulate what impact they have on their organization. I know Shannon helps a lot of companies deal with these types of problems. In fact, before this call, Shannon and I were talking about something she's helping a lot of struggling companies with, around these new requirements, and that's around things like Sarbanes-Oxley. Shannon, you want to just tell us your story about the 3 months you've spent not sleeping and dealing with Sarbanes-Oxley?
Yes, of course. Some of you may have already heard or don't know, or maybe this is new to you, but as of December 18th, there's been new requirements around Sarbanes-Oxley. And that is that companies are now required to disclose in a formal format all of their security breaches or things that are materiality. And we'll get to that another day. So it is causing companies to have to prove a lot more around their controls to ensure that they've got proper procedures in place, not only around security, but around areas that were never looked at before. So the auditors have increased their testing requirements, as well as trying to get comfort over what security is in the environment. So it has been pretty intense at 3 of my clients right now, where the auditors are asking for things they have never asked before. And a bunch of my colleagues, as well as other organizations I've worked with, are all saying the same thing. They have never seen anything like this before. And so 2024 and 2025 are going to be big years for Sarbanes-Oxley. It's almost like we're starting all over again with the 2002 rollout of it.
Yeah, and I've witnessed on all the calls I've had with you over the last few months, of every time we talk, there's a fire that you're dealing with on behalf of a customer that's trying to make sense of all of this. So the pain is real.
Yes, it is.
So I've been talking to a lot of folks in security teams as well, and there's really four categories of problems that I've identified that security teams are really struggling with. I think we all understand that security and GRC is still very manual and expensive, and a lot of it is still in the stone ages of screenshots and spreadsheets. And constantly we're dealing with lack of resources. Um, on the flip side, the business is requiring GRC and security teams to uh, keep increasing the number of things that they can support to be able to expand the business and go into new markets in changing regulatory environments. Something that again Dan and I have talked a lot about is around the SEC rulings in America and all the public companies that are right now trying to figure out how to keep up with that changing regulatory environment. Dan, have you experienced that yourself? Are you talking to folks? I know you advise a lot of folks as well around sort of what that change looks like and how people are dealing with it.
Yeah, so I think the marked change is that the SEC and the FTC and NYDFS and other regulators are starting to introduce the word materiality. So what they're asking for is they're asking businesses to protect their customers, their partners, their clients from material events via cybersecurity. And that really draws a line in the sand for organizations because you can calculate what is material. It's usually 5-10% of revenue, somewhere in there. And so I think the difficult part for security teams is how do we present the data and take something that's very qualitative and make it as quantitative as possible, so the business can make that decision upon what is material and what isn't material. So again, that seems to be where the focus is, and you'll notice that you look at how the SEC proceeded with Uber. With the Joe Sullivan case, that was Uber, when Uber was a private company in 2015, and so you're seeing that they're even taking these actions with companies that aren't even publicly traded.
Yeah, and with I love a couple of things that you alluded to. One of which is on this slide around making it quantitative. So this is a theme I'm also seeing a lot, where the impact of the things you're doing on liability on the business is extremely qualitative. So it's really hard to justify the value of the work that security teams are doing, and they're all trying to figure out how to make it quantitative, because that allows you to make it really clear where you are and as also what impact you're delivering over time. And then the other thing also that ties to what you're saying is around visibility. It's around the materiality and being able to disclose with confidence what measures you have in place, but also like what the risks are and what the impact of those is. And if you don't know from a spreadsheet or a point in time assessment where you are, makes it really hard to be able to keep up with those requirements. The consequence of these changing dynamics and problems is GRC typically then gets boxed into a cost center, and the challenge with that is it becomes really hard to justify additional spend, ask for budgets, because essentially you're still doing manual processes, you're using static information, you're using point-in-time assessments, and you're finding it hard to adapt. And this is a trend I'm seeing a lot with GRC teams that are trying to figure out how to justify the business impact that they're making, to be able to ask for more budget, to be able to have conversations around the liability they're reducing for the business, and so on. Dan, as your time as a CISO in multiple companies, I know you've thought a lot about this as well. Like, what are some of the challenges you ran into from having your department be looked at as a cost center, and what are some of the things that you try to solve in those situations?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think there's a couple things. I think first, it's I think the business needs to assume, particularly if, I've been the first CISO at 2 companies, and then Paxos, where I'm at now, I'm the 3rd CISO. And I think a lot of organizations, when they bring a CISO in, they think like, okay, well, we've got a guy for that or a girl for that, so we're good. But I think what they miss is like, you're bringing in a leader, someone who's, skilled in this, and there may be some foundational building blocks that are missing altogether. I think that's the one thing, is that there's this initial need potentially to invest. I think the other aspect of it, when you are a cost center or viewed as a cost center, right, is that well, we made that investment one time. It's like a high school graduation. You got your diploma, and you threw your cap in the air, and I don't want to hear about it anymore. And it's really like the ongoing care and feeding of the program, and also the fact that the regulatory environment, the attacker environment, the threat environment, all these things are dynamic. And so, just because we spent and did this thing last year doesn't mean that we can just, rinse and repeat that and do that for 2024 as an example. And so I think the main responsibility for security and compliance professionals is to tie the risk to, again, going back to, that materiality standard, and trying to work with the business, and whether it's your general counsel or your CFO or maybe an operations person, to tie it to like, hey, here's how this risk that we have, whether it's compliance risk or security risk, really just tie that to that. And I think that that's really important. I don't think that to use a race car analogy, I don't think that a race car driver views brakes as a slow center. So why should we review? But why should we be viewing security as a cost center, right? It's really about safety, and security is really about safety, enabling your business to operate in a safe manner.
Yeah, I love that race car analogy. Brakes are not an optional feature of a race car.
Yeah.
And I see we have one question in the chat around risk materiality. I think you addressed that. The question is around how are teams calculating that? Is there any reasonable, or do you want to recommend anything around calculating risk materiality or any frameworks around that time?
So I think you need to ask your finance person what material cost is to the company. So that's really, the foundation of where you start. And then from that, you should calculate, impact times likelihood to determine what a risk would be. Another easy way to think about that is, let's say you have, this is not an example of Paxos, but let's say that you have a large IT infrastructure, and you rely on routers to support your IT backbone. Maybe you have a bunch of retail stores or something. You take the routers right out of the box, you plug it into your network, and you don't change the admin password, right? Like the whole Equifax way Equifax is breached. Like those are what if those risks are realized, they're not only critical, but they're also like what I would refer to as dumb risk, right? Like that's something that you would be embarrassed by if that came out in the news. And so I think it's important to kind of also view that lens of like, are there just basic things that we should be doing that we're not doing that are very critical, that could cause either a company extinction event, or it could cause, material harm to the business.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you, Dan. And something to that effect in the latter half of the presentation, around the 6-point scorecard, is we have some practical examples to share, and I'll bring in Dan and Shannon for that as well, where we've taken some examples from companies we've worked with that have done a good job quantifying some of these types of risks. The CISOs that are being able to have these conversations around budgets and impact of spend and so on are all sort of thinking about how do we turn GRC into a profit center, and what does a profit center even mean or look like for a GRC program. So essentially, if you break it down to like what is the business impact that your GRC program is having on your business, it starts with protecting the company and board from liability. So how do you quantify the liability you're reducing and the personal liability that you're reducing for the board and CISO with the activities in your GRC. How are you lowering costs of doing things like audits, assurance, and so on? How are you actually enabling revenue? Something that James brought up, which is very close to my heart, is this dread of security question. As we have all seen a 700 question security questionnaire that we need to fill out to close a deal. Can we tie activities we're doing, like answering security questions, directly to growth in the business? And then finally, are the set of things that I'm working on helping me create an enterprise-wide culture of security and privacy? If you are able to demonstrate and quantify how the activities you're doing in your security and GRC teams affect these types of business metrics, it becomes a lot easier to have those conversations at the leadership level. We've been thinking about these problems quite a lot, and the three sort of pillars or core enablers for transforming GRC and starting to think about it as a way to drive business and revenue is to make it predictive, integrated, and transparent. We talked a lot about the change that's happening constantly that security teams are keeping up with. So how do you make your GRC program, your control assurance, adapt to a changing landscape around risk? How do you bring different parts of the data you have fragmented across the business into one consolidated view so you can actually make sense out of the risk you have in the business, as well as the operationalization that you've been able to do with your control programs? And then how do you make it clear and transparent so that you're able to not only do the check the box exercise that you're required to do, but we actually go beyond that and be able to do real assurance with your customers and your leadership. The combination of these three things is what we're calling trust assurance, and there's a whole set of companies that are now starting to lean into what trust assurance can do for them. The idea of trust assurance is you're establishing trust with a variety of stakeholders, including your customers, your vendors, your boards, your auditors, and so on. And the ability to do that in a way that delivers on this promise of predictive, integrated, and transparent. We believe this is where GRC will go in the next few years. We are firmly on this train of enabling our customers to drive trust assurance for their businesses. Shannon, I'd love to get from you. I know you have been helping a lot of businesses, and I know you've been thinking about how to drive assurance for a long time. Where do you see the businesses or the companies that are further ahead on this curve? What do you think they're doing better or differently than everybody else?
They're streamlining their processes. They're simplifying. They're using systematic approaches, right? And those are trigger words because it's how do you do that, right? How do I streamline my process? How do I have an environment where I make ISO 27001 with one set of auditors and FedRAMP with another set of auditors work, right? And how do I get organizations to trust what's there? Because realistically, if you work with some organizations and you have a SOC 2 or an ISO, because you're a small shop, they may not rely on that. And they may say, nope, you still have to fill out this questionnaire because we don't trust your attestations or your reports or your certifications. So how do we get there? We've got to, as companies, streamline the process, simplify it, and figure out ways how we can all within this industry rely on security standards better, right? Because there's no consistency across the board. There's no consistency across auditors or tools. So what is it that's going to get us there, right? It's really finding ways to simplify, streamline, and make it a systematic approach.
Yeah, I love that. I love the streamlined part of that as well, because something that I've put on this chart, but really, what I'm seeing is it starts off being an exercise that primarily enables you to be in the market and do the things that you need to do for selling.
Yes.
But as companies start going rightwards on this spectrum, um, things like expanding your total addressable market, um, and eventually getting to a point where you have clarity with your board of directors, with disclosures, with things like cyber insurance, to to a point where you can be proactive about these things and be able to showcase the impact you're having against um, multiple of these objectives, not just being able to check a box to be compliant with one or more security standards. That's where the folks who are more on the right side of the spectrum are going.
Well, and that's a huge aspect of this, right? Everyone thinks that compliance is the check the box activities. And for the most part, it gets to that point because it's overwhelming. But realistically, a compliance team and a security team should be best friends. They should be figuring out how to work together to properly message the wants and needs of the organization, right? Compliance is a revenue generating tool. It's how organizations get sales. You have RFPs that will literally say, do not apply for this job unless you have a SOC 2. Do not come to us unless you've got ISO 27001. This is where organizations, whether the compliance team, the security team, and if they're one, should be figuring out how, as a group, to take that knowledge and understanding of, if I need this for sales, how do I better the organization and promote a trust assurance method? How do I make us secure and meet the demands? But it's also getting away from the fear and the hypotheticals, because it's a double-edged sword where some people historically look at the security teams and saying, oh my gosh, all these bad things are going to happen, which in today's world, they are happening, right? So more and more people are seeing it.
Yeah.
But as a group, we've got to be working together to communicate this message, to allow for it to promote and do sales enablement, right? Because companies grow when security's there. Companies grow when you can prove there's compliance there, because that means more customers and organizations can rely on you and can trust on what you have as an environment and tools and data, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I can tell you the story of a company that I've been working with for the last several years, where they were doing great with having a set of certifications and managing risk. But I've been working with the leader of the GRC team there, and she realized that the company now is likely to go IPO. And this is not just having a spreadsheet with risks and having a check the box set of compliance requirements just doesn't cut it. And so they're starting to now see bullet points 3, 4, and 5 on this sheet, where how do you prepare a company for IPO and expansion into new markets, unless you are able to have this level of assurance and transparency with now being put in a much more stringent regulatory environment.
And that is an absolutely great point, because one of the things that IPOs differentiate from just security requirements is Sarbanes-Oxley and a SOC 2 are two different worlds. Sarbanes-Oxley and FedRAMP are two different worlds. So just because you have a FedRAMP certification, a SOC 2 attestation, an ISO certification, does not mean you are going to pass the SOX audit, a Sarbanes-Oxley audit. And that is one of the big things that I have been experiencing with the organizations I'm working with, is they are acquiring companies that have never had a Sarbanes-Oxley environment before, but they have some certifications, and they thought they were going to pass mustard with a Sarbanes-Oxley audit. But they are failing because they can't get comfort over, one, materiality, and two, they can't get comfort over completeness and accuracy because they've never had to do it before. And so that is key aspects in all of this, is understanding where you're going and what needs to be done. So if you're going to go IPO, you've got to understand the requirements around IPOing. And it's not just, oh, I have all these certifications already for the security and compliance needs that my customers demand. It's now looking at it from a financial aspect and saying, how am I going to be impacted when I have a continuous audit all year long, and these auditors in here every single month asking me about my environment and asking me about the tools I use to meet the financial compliance needs.
Absolutely, yeah, and now when I in the new environment, once I go IPO, I'm going to have the board asking me about SEC disclosures and how do I have handle on those things and how do I prepare for those things.
Oh yes.
So yeah, makes sense. I think the biggest sort of learnings for me in observing companies that are being able to deliver trust assurance is around how it reframes the role of the security team. The rest of the organization looking at the security team as an ally. I think Shannon mentioned something about security and compliance teams being friends. I think that resonates a lot with me as well. And then I think the big other benefit that I've seen the successful teams doing is to create this value-centric approach to the company and the board, where there's a big gap between what the language that the board speaks or the leadership team speaks and the language that security and GRC team speaks. I know Dan and I have talked a lot about this as well. Is one of the big challenges of the CISO's job is to translate the world of security and GRC into the language that the board and GRC, the board and leadership team speak. Dan, I know you've thought about this. Do you want to add to that in like what challenges you've been seeing with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the bigger thing is as security compliance professionals, we are constantly surrounded by gaps and failures of our organization, of our environments. We see that server that's not patched. We see maybe change process that's not working properly or whatever. And when you get to the role of leading the security program, and you really need to focus on being a business executive as much as you do on being a security professional. You really need to understand, where does security risk prioritize with the rest of the risks and opportunities that the business has. And I think communicating that and being committed to that and demonstrating that commitment, that there may be some risks that the company's willing to take on. I mean, obviously, if the company was in the business of zero risk, then it would cease to exist. And so I think it's really important that security folks embrace that and say, hey, understand we've got some cost pressures in the market because the economy is going down and people are pulling back. How does that risk compare with, this InfoSec or this compliance risk that we have? And so I think that's probably the number one thing. And then also communicating that between the security team, the IT teams, the technical teams, and then the business teams as well. It's got to be a two-way street of communication, of exchanging, kind of what the risks are, what we can do about them. How can we make sure that we're communicating these risks in a way that the business can understand? Because if I say, someone is, tunneling into, a host, the business has no idea what that is and why it's a problem. And so I think it's important to make sure that we're also putting in terms of the folks in the business are going to understand.
Yeah, I love it. I love that you sort of teed up the topic around how do we showcase this, how do we demonstrate this, how do we present this, which is something that I want to go into next. Before we go into that and the scorecard, just quickly wanted to check with James if he's still around. Do we want to take any questions, or do you have any questions? I know you had some ideas you wanted to share as well.
Yeah, Tejas, thanks for jumping back. I think you did a great job at answering kind of the vendor side me question in terms of bulking in how what you're doing and this concept helps you out materially grow the business. But I did see something that kind of echoed onto Shannon, what you were talking about. One of the folks was wondering, isn't there a way to better present kind of the opportunity of security by the quality that you're doing? And I think quality is a great term there, because there's doing security and there's doing security well. And if you're doing it well, isn't that an advantage? I didn't know if you maybe wanted to touch on that a little.
Shannon?
Yes, sorry, trying to find the mute button at the same time is difficult sometimes. I just got a lot since I was giggling. Can you repeat the question one more time? Because I totally just got sidetracked on telling you I couldn't find the mute button.
No worries, I found it as well. So yeah, I think the question, you were talking about how highlighting security, the concept of security, the integration of security with compliance is an advantage. But there was an interesting question about talking about the quality of your security program and being able to highlight that. And I thought it just kind of flowed into what you were talking about. And maybe you could address ways to kind of positively highlight the fact you're actually doing a great job in security.
Yeah, quality is very, very beneficial, right? It's a getting away from the check the box activity, right? So it's not about everyone says it's not about the quantity, it's about the quality. So how do you make sure you do it right the first time and you're not duct taping it and making it work, right? I always say to people, I'm waving a magic wand to try and figure out how to make this work all over the place, because I'm being brought into organizations to help them get to a finish line, and they've already been doing something for 2 years, and you're finding out the quality's not there, it's not accurate. So we're rewinding the clock and having to fix it. Great example is trying to plan for something that's going to come down the pipeline. One example is I have a client right now that's doing a FedRAMP certification, and they've had a product for 2 years. Well, all of a sudden they have to make sure that they're meeting the FIPS qualification. And guess what? FIPS is a big requirement for FedRAMP, and they didn't use the appropriate FIPS libraries. Well, is that a quality issue, or is it a budget issue, or is it both, right? So there is so many aspects there, but now they have to rewind the clock and start all over again. And that is a lot of money related to building up the product. If they had thought ahead, everyone does that. But quality, there's so many avenues on where you could go with this. Some of it's thinking ahead and understanding where you want to go. And some of it is trying to make sure you've got a program from the start and not trying to put one in place. And Dan, I'm sure you can contest to this, as it's easier if you start from scratch than try to figure out how to mold it after everyone's got bad habits.
Yeah, no, it's very true. I mean, my take on this question might be, it depends how the business views security. I mean, a lot of businesses view security as the garbage people, right? Garbage man shows up every Wednesday at 8 o'clock, takes the garbage away. The only time you get upset is if the garbage isn't taken away. With security, security and compliance are usually can possess two of the three following characteristics: good, fast, and cheap. And good and fast security is not cheap. And so I think the quality aspect of it is difficult, because that quality, if your business, like, to use another analogy, if you're a starving person, you don't really care if you have high quality food, you just want food. Now, if you're like Amazon, right, or Google, or one of the big FANG companies where, pretty flush with cash, the implications of failure are pretty high, then quality for security really matters. So I think it's a reflection of the business and where they're at, and really how they view it. I would imagine a retail store like a Home Depot or a Lowe's or somebody probably doesn't really place the value of quality. And I apologize to anyone attending from those organizations. It probably doesn't place the value of quality for security as, say, Salesforce.com, where that has to be a part of the platform because it's a part of the product or service that they provide. So I really think it depends on the company and their perspective on the value they deliver to their customers.
And actually, that's a really great point right there. And not many people will know this on the phone, but a SOC 2, everyone's right now getting SOC 2s all over the place, right, to meet sales requirements and sales enablement. It's being passed around like candy to some level, right? It's a check the box activity. It's not really proving security these days. So Salesforce acquired a company called MuleSoft, right? MuleSoft is a major API integrating tool that is used all over the place. MuleSoft had a passing SOC 2 report before Salesforce acquired them. They now go to Salesforce. They have to go through Salesforce's auditors. They had a failing report 2 years in a row because they did not meet the quality level of Salesforce's standards. So that is something that people need to understand is your a level of expectations and quality is in so many different variants, and you can't just go fast and get it done. You should really be looking and assessing and making sure that the quality is there and you're not just checking the box, because when you want to get to that next level, you're going to find you're not going to be able to do it, or you're going to have issues that could impact your customers. And MuleSoft was lucky that they didn't impact their customers necessarily because they had Salesforce, but it did impact a lot of organizations that were publicly traded companies who had to prove there was no financial impact to a qualified report from MuleSoft.
Yeah, I love those stories. And Dan, I really like the analogies. I think we went from race cars to I don't know to what else, but it really helped solidify the point you're making around what should be a priority. When do you prioritize quality versus cost and so on. So I wanted to take it back to we said there are certain benefits to being able to deliver trust assurance and what it represents. I wanted to make it a little bit more practical and talk about how do you present that you are being able to achieve some of these things, and how do you get from a point where your board and leadership and the rest of your organization can understand that you're delivering trust assurance to the business. So what I'd love to sort of segue into a little bit is some practical examples and tips on how do you demonstrate a scorecard, or how do you self-evaluate yourself or your business on a scorecard on where you stand in that maturity model that we talked about earlier. And there's 6 different sort of sub areas that we'll cover with examples. The first one being sort of how is the investment and what is the ROI on that investment? What's the risk exposure? What's the liability from it? How are you doing on the compliance and regulatory side? What is the level of culture that you're building around trust and security in the business? Where is your process and technology maturity? And then finally, sort of what are some of the external metrics you can bring to present a comprehensive picture? A lot of this type of information is something that I'm seeing GRC leaders take to either CISOs or their leadership teams. And it is now becoming sort of a requirement for you to do some version of this on a periodic basis, on a quarterly basis, for leaders in the organization to understand the impacts. And so what we've come up with is an opinionated view of what this could look like, and what does that presentation to that leadership team look like for a GRC leader. So start with, and again, I'd love to bring in Dan on this. Dan, I've been working with people, but Dan's actually been in the shoes of somebody who's been doing this in multiple different companies. So an executive summary for a CISO, Dan, can you walk us through what your executive summary looks like when you are presenting as a CISO to the rest of the leadership team?
Yeah, so I think, well, the rest of the leadership team, and I'll just say and the board, because I think there's definitely crossover there. So I think the main thing is, coming in, doing some sort of formal risk assessment. Typically you want to base it upon an industry standard or an industry framework. So you could say NIST, Common Security Framework, or maybe there's some best practices within I'll say a industry specific, like NYDFS for financial services or HIPAA for healthcare. And then really kind of walk through, the various domains or the various aspects of that framework, and do the gap analysis. Do we meet this in terms of, do we have a policy that says we do this thing? Okay, great. Do we actually do the thing that we have a policy about, and can we provide evidence of it? I think that's very valuable to go through that very methodically and point that out. I think the other thing that's really important too is to understand both customer obligation. So do we have customers that require us to Shannon's point, to have a SOC 2 or an ISO 27001? And then also the threat environment, right? So what are the threats that are in our environment? What are our peer organizations undergoing? When I was in healthcare, I remember last year, the year before, there was a hospital in Indiana that had a ransomware attack so badly they actually shut the hospital down permanently because they lost so much money from the ransomware event that they had to shut out the doors, right? That I can tell you that got the attention of the executives of that organization when I shared that. And so I think kind of putting all those together and saying, here's the current capacity of what we have, here are the critical gaps, and then here's what's going to take to close them, and really just laying it out, and really saying, it's not incumbent upon the security team to figure it out. It's really incumbent upon them to state, here's the risk, and then here's the options we have to treat that risk, right? We could buy some cyber insurance, we can get it, right? Because that's almost like an audit these days. And maybe transfer some of the risk. We can accept the risk and kind of live with it. And maybe that's a reality. Maybe the business does not have the revenue. Maybe it's in a contracting phase. And so, whether it makes everyone uncomfortable, but they have to live with the risk. Maybe there's some other things we can do to mitigate or to, I would say, limit the risk. But ultimately, it needs to be a business decision to say, do we want to mitigate this risk? If we do, here's the cost of it. Here's a couple of ways we go about doing it, whether we hire FTEs or, build a solution internally or buy tools or use consultants. And so I think that's really, that's the picture that you want to paint. And I think putting it, in a summary, very similar to what you see up here on the screen is a good way to go.
Yeah. And I think the thing you said about FTEs and costs and tools is very relevant, because ultimately you're sort of making the case of what is the liability impact in terms of dollar values versus what is the dollar value of me having the ability to remediate some of these risks in the business. And it becomes a trade-off decision of like, what is the business willing to absorb and what does the business need to fix and what is the cost of that, which becomes the conversation that the leadership team and the board didn't get to have.
Yeah, and it looks like Tony in the comments has a question, or wants to comment on his question about Pfizer. His comment is that Pfizer had a cybersecurity insurance about 4 years ago when they had a breach. However, they had to go to court with the cybersecurity insurer to be made whole. I think that's pretty standard, because I think if you go back 4 years ago or 5 years ago, the cyber insurance was really an afterthought. It was a one-page, fill out your name, your company's name. Do you have a CISO? Do you patch things? Do you do some basic things? And if you fast forward, to 2023, 2024, the losses have been so great in the cybersecurity insurance space that the applications have become more like audits. I had one last year that was like 17 tabs of hundreds of questions on each tab. And so, it's essentially, I'm sure 4 or 5 years ago when Pfizer, had that specific incident, the insurer basically said, nope, not covered. And Pfizer had to go back and say, it is covered because you had this very general part of the policy. And so that's very similar to what you would see with like an insurance adjuster and having to maybe fight your insurance company if you were in an automobile accident or something like that.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you, Dan. I think the other thing that I've seen a lot is, and I know Dan, you and I have talked about this as well, is tell me the top risks and what is my concise representation of the top risks in the business and their dollar impact on the business that I can present. And I think a lot of folks sort of assume that the boards and leadership teams they present to sort of want to understand the entire picture, but a lot of the times what's really helps crystallize that is to come up with a very concise set of things that demand the attention of the rest of the business and how those are trending over time. And typically these will change every quarter, and that's something you can show around which ones have increased or reduced since the last time that the conversation was had. And then, finally, going back to our conversation earlier about demonstrating your impact on revenue and business business metrics, it's can we as GRC leaders tie our activities into every quarter being able to do one of three sets of things: either facilitating revenue, how many deals did we close, how much did we protect in contractual liability of contracts we've signed with our customers, how did we change the risk exposure, did that actually materially change, and is there a dollar value we can put? And then finally, Shannon's point earlier, compliance being a way to accelerate the business and open new markets. How do we tie the activities we did around compliance and how they made a difference in the material business that the company can do? So again, an example that really resonates with leadership teams is around, can you demonstrate how in each of these buckets the activities you've been doing contribute to the net business metric that they all tie to. Shannon, I know, again, would love to get your take on where you've helped companies present and come up with their business impact around their security and governance programs. Does this make sense to you? Is there anything you would add to this or do differently?
No, this actually makes complete sense to me. It's what I do when I work with organizations, of identifying what the revenue is, and how to close the deal, right? If something costs $150,000 to get it done and you're going to get $2 million, that's usually can be a no-brainer to some organizations. What's the risk, right? I think a lot of companies have a really hard time understanding risk exposure, because you have to explain external, internal risk exposure and what the impact is. And that's one of the big things that I've been having to explain to organizations and have to prove continuously. It's not just external risk exposure, it's also internal risk exposure you have to worry about. It's where the problems can rely, right? Because as you know, some of the internal risk exposure is your accounting team clicks a link and now all of a sudden you've got malware all over your organization. What's the impact, right? And how do you make sure to prevent that? And compliance, I love compliance. Clearly, that's what I do. And so this all makes sense to me.
Yeah, I was going to ask you the question that you answered, which is, out of these, what do you think is the hardest one for businesses or security teams to quantify? And I think the thing you said about risk exposure sort of resonated with me as well. That's one that a lot of teams are really struggling to quantify.
And this goes back to the point of what Dan brought up earlier when we were talking about materiality. Defining materiality at companies is quite difficult, right? Because you can do it from a financial aspect, right? They've been doing it all along. What's the materiality of revenue? It's 1% to 5% of revenue, right? So if you have a $100 billion company, 1% materiality is $100 million, right? So how does that apply across the board when it comes to security, right? What does that mean? And what do we start putting dollars and cents to our data? Because security is all about securing the company and the data around it. So are we going to start putting dollar values to our customer data? Are we going to start putting dollar values to the HR data in the organization? So if a breach were to happen and you lose 3,000 records, and each of those records is worth $10 a piece, is that materiality, right? This is going to be a really fascinating way of people having to think.
Completely agree. Yeah, makes sense. And I just wanted to, we're nearing the end of our session, but I know this content is available to all the attendees. Something that we also put together is based on these three sort of key examples, a set of real world examples of how to demonstrate these kinds of metrics in your periodic updates to your leadership teams. So again, this is all available for everybody, but as an appendix, I'd love to call out that we have some examples of these charts that we've seen customers use really successfully. I wanted to throw it back over to James if there are any other thoughts or questions we want to take before we start wrapping up. James?
Yeah, thanks, Tejas. Yeah, you went right where I wanted to go, which was I was hoping to see some stuff that would help me with metrics because, Air Force guy loves PowerPoint. Who would have thought? So I think quantifying the efforts that you've done and being able to show that would seem to make sense when you're talking to the leadership team and the board. Maybe it'd be great to get Dan and Shannon's view on that just real quick since we have a couple of minutes left.
Dan, you want to go first? I talk a lot.
Yeah, that's fine. I think it's setting the kind of the context of the environment that the company's operating in. So if you have, news or, media that you can share where, competitor companies are, having security issues or compliance issues, I think it's always valuable. I think the other aspect of it is, if you have some threat telemetry inside your organization, to say like, hey, did you know last month the CEO was, there was 45 phishing attempts against their account or impersonation attempts against their, corporate account, I think is valuable. I think that, a lot of companies want to know that they're not the slowest runner when the bear's chasing them. But I think what they don't realize is, number one, every business environment is completely different. And number two, the standard that the regulators are holding us to more and more is this materiality. So it really doesn't matter that we're better than our competitor. What matters is are we good enough to safeguard against material risk? And so I would just keep driving back to that. I think anytime you can have a third party assessment come in from the outside to do some sort of assessment against a benchmark, that's always great as well, as you see here on the screen. Those are all things that really resonate with boards and executives.
I agree. It's also finding ways to educate them, because honestly, some of the board members don't understand this and it's new to them, right? They understand a piece of it. They understand maybe the accounting side of it, but they don't understand how security correlates. So it's really understanding how to explain to them in their language. And I think I said this at the beginning to James, Dan, and Teja before we started the call, is it's really understanding how to speak the language of the person you're presenting to. So you really need to understand who's on the board, who you're speaking to in the C-suite, and have them understand what you're relaying. And the dashboards are great, but sometimes they look at those numbers and it will go over your head. We had a big project come up and I had to explain to them what non-human accounts were to the CFO. And he understood, but he didn't understand it. So we had to simplify it in his language. So it's always a fun way.
Shannon, Dan, Tejas, thanks for covering that. I think we're in a pretty good spot to wrap up. I know Amelia has a couple of administrative notes, but I wanted to thank the three of you for a really helpful and informative presentation. You jumped right through the questions. I'll give it the 10 seconds for anybody to last drop one in real quick. But otherwise, back over to you, Amelia, for your notes.
Thank you. And thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you to our three presenters, and thank you, Jim, for moderating today. As a reminder, after today's event, a recorded version of this webcast will be available on the ISSA web conference page. You'll also be able to download it to get any of that appendix items that Tejas put together for you guys. You'll also be able to print a viewing certificate on the webcast on Bright Talk that you can submit for your continuing education credits, such as CPE and CEUs, in accordance with various certifying bodies. If you have any questions, please contact us at memberservices@issa.org. And if you would like to share your feedback on social media, please either tag us or TrustCloud and use ISSA Web Conference as the hashtag. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope you guys all have a great rest of your day.